We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
Welcome to the not-too-distant future. At the dawn of the 21st century, space agencies in Europe and America began making plans to land the first humans on Mars. It would be the most scientifically complex and financially crippling exploration ever taken by man. Or would it? This is the story of how two outsiders blew apart the scientific community with a scheme that would take us to the Red Planet, using chemical engineering from the 19th century. For some, Mars holds the answers to mankind's future in space. Others say Mars is too far, too dangerous, and too expensive for humans to explore. More than 30 years after the last Apollo astronaut walked on the moon, the American manned space program seems to have lost its way. With the tragic loss of the crew aboard the space shuttle Columbia, the debate has begun.
We've got a problem. NASA has been literally going around in circles with its space program for the past 30 years.
Astronautical engineer Dr. Robert Zubrin has been arguing for years that sending humans to Mars should be the mission for a modern space agency.
It's time that we set goals for NASA that were worthy of the risks of human spaceflight. Mars is the next logical step in our space program. It's the challenge that's been staring us in the face for the past 30 years. It's the planet that's most likely Earth. It's the planet that has on it the resources needed to support life and therefore someday technological civilization. It's the planet that will provide us with the answer as to whether life is prevalent in the universe or exclusive to the Earth. And it's the planet that will give us the critical test as to whether humanity can break out of the planet of our birth and become a spacefaring species.
In the early 1990s, Zubrin was the head of the Mars Direct program at Martin Marietta Astronautics. His team developed a mission to Mars that could be carried out at a fraction of NASA's projected costs. Using only existing technology, Zubrin argues that the first steps on Martian soil could be made within 10 years.
There is absolutely nothing in this that is beyond our technology.
We are not ready to send humans to Mars right now. We don't know how to keep them alive. There are people out there who say we can go to Mars tomorrow. One of my requirements, one of NASA's requirements, is that if we send humans to Mars, we bring them back alive.
For the past 15 years, Zubrin and his colleagues have waged a campaign to convince society and the political class that humans on Mars should be the goal for NASA now. This is the story of our cold neighboring planet and the debate over whether man's fate is tied to the red world. It's the story of an engineer's journey and the battle of ideas over which direction in space will truly benefit mankind.
We either muster the courage to go, or we risk the possibility of stagnation and decay.
The victor in this debate could determine the fate of mankind. Will we become a spacefaring species? Will we live on more than one planet?
Sputnik.
But who will lead the charge for our celestial future?
I was 5 when Sputnik flew. And while to the adults, Sputnik was a terrifying event, to me, as a child who was already reading science fiction, it was exhilarating, because it meant that this possibility of a spacefaring future was going to be real. And I was 9 when Kennedy gave his speech committing us to the moon.
To go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
I grew up during the 60s when it was Mercury, it was Gemini, it was Apollo. Every month, NASA was doing something more impressive than in the month before. We were going to be on the moon by 1970, Mars by 1980, Saturn by 1990, Alpha Centauri by the year 2000. We were moving out, and I wanted to be part of that. And so I got myself a scientific education. But then in the early 70s, it's all collapsed. We achieved the first part of that program, Moon by 1970, but the Nixon administration shut down the rest, and we did not move out into space. And for a while, I accepted that, grudgingly. I became a science teacher. But then in the early 80s, something hit me, and I said, I'm not going to accept myself doing less than what I had dreamed of doing when I was a boy.
So Zubrin went to work at Martin Marietta, which later became Lockheed Martin, designing interplanetary missions. Now he's president of the Mars Society.
Mars is where the future is. Mars is the closest planet to the Earth that has on it all the resources needed to support life and therefore technological civilization. It has water, it has carbon, it has nitrogens, it has a 24-hour day, it has a complex geological history that has created mineral ore, it has sources of geothermal energy. Mars is a place we can settle.
One reason for such optimism over a frozen world like Mars is evidence that 2 billion years ago, Mars was a much warmer and wetter place.
We think that at one time in the ancient past, Mars was very similar to the condition of early Earth.
This Martian warm age lasted for over 1 billion years and could have been a suitable environment for the development of life.
If we go to Mars and find evidence of a second genesis on Mars, I think we can conclude that the universe is full of life. We can probably conclude that on some planets that life evolves to more complex forms, and I think we'd be reasonable to conclude that intelligence could also emerge on some planets as well. It really does answer the question, are we alone? And that to me is a question that transcends science. It's a philosophical, societal, as well as scientific question. To me, that's the big prize. That's why Mars is interesting. That's why human exploration makes sense.
There are those who say that we have many problems to deal with here on Earth, and we need to postpone ventures such as the human exploration on Mars until these problems are solved. But we also have to think of the future. We also have to think about opening up new volumes in human history. I believe that it's essential for a positive human future that humanity expand into space. The greatest value that we got out of Apollo was the creation of intellectual capital through the inspiring of millions to go into science and engineering to be part of the great adventure of human expansion into space.
There's a phrase that happened with the Apollo program, which was, if we can go to the moon, we can. And then everybody's filled in whatever they were interested in. Build mass transit, cure cancer, do this, do that. The point is, it did give us a sense that we could accomplish great things. It did bring out the best of us.
In the summer of 1989, President Bush announced the Space Exploration Initiative, directing NASA to draw up long-term plans to get humans back to the moon and begin developing a program of manned Mars exploration. At Martin Marietta, Zubrin and his colleagues looked forward to igniting NASA's space program after 2 decades in low Earth orbit.
Of course, we were very excited when Bush made his call saying that he was making a national commitment to implement such a program.
NASA assembled a large team to take on the space initiative. In 90 days, the team developed a 30-year plan that required an enormous buildup of space infrastructure.
What the NASA bureaucracy decided to do was basically design the most complex mission they possibly could in order to make sure that everyone's pet technology would remain mission critical, which is the exact opposite of the correct way to do engineering.
First, NASA would triple the size of the planned space station and add enormous hangars, as well as free-floating fuel depots and crew stations. In space, they would build ships that could travel on to the moon. Then, on the moon, they would construct more shipbuilding facilities, bases, and depots. Next, the moon crew would construct the Mars ship, a huge craft, dubbed by its detractors as Battlestar Galactica. The ship would carry everything to Mars over an 18-month flight, descend to the surface, spend a few days there, then plant a flag in the ground and go home. The plan became known as the 90-day report.
To those of us at Martin who had been engaged in designing Mars missions, when they saw the monstrosity of complexity of the 90-day report, we were dismayed, and it was readily apparent to anyone with any insight that that program would fail politically.
The plan was submitted to Congress. The estimated cost, $450 billion. The legislators went into shock. This would have been the single most expensive program for the United States since World War II. By the end of 1990, Congress had refused all requests for funding. When the realization came that the project was doomed, Zubrin wrote a memo to his colleagues at Martin Marietta, outlining his problems with the NASA plan and arguing for a more direct approach. Zubrin favored launching a Mars mission directly from the surface of Earth, using only existing rocket technology. This negated the need for a lunar base and avoided the complexity and cost of building ships in space. He also objected to NASA's plan for a short surface stay on Mars, a mission that would amount to little more than a flag and footprint exercise. To Zubrin, we were going to Mars to explore and develop a new world. To maximize surface time, Zubrin proposed using a faster flight path, known as a conjunction-class mission. This would mean a crew could arrive on Mars after only a 6-month journey. They would then remain on the Martian surface for a year and a half. This would give the team time to explore a wide area and conduct detailed research about the planet. Then, as the Earth return window opened, the crew would launch from Mars for a 6-month trip home. Along with several like-minded colleagues, Zubrin decided to ask management at Martin to allow them to design alternative Mars missions.
The management approved that, and we formed a team. It was known as the Scenario Development Team, of just 12 people from the whole very large Martin company.
There was one team member whose thinking was closely aligned with Zubrin's.
I went off to my office and said, all right, how would I do a Mars mission if I had to pay for it and I had to go on the ride? And I said, well, it's going to be simple. There's going to be no on-orbit assembly. I really tried to take everything out of the mission that didn't absolutely need to be there.
While the rest of the team focused on longer-term, more traditional mission plans that required on-orbit assembly, Zubrin and Baker decided to collaborate on a mission with a quicker turnaround.
We decided to do Mars the way Lewis and Clark did America. Okay? Use local resources, travel light, live off the land.
Zubrin and Baker were convinced that a Mars mission could be launched directly from the ground. The other team members felt this was impossible, that the weight of the rocket fuel required for a round trip to Mars was so enormous it would render the launch ship impossibly heavy. To solve this problem, Zubrin was exploring a radical idea that had been kicked around the aerospace industry since the mid-1970s. The idea was to produce a methane-oxygen rocket fuel directly from the Martian atmosphere. It was a robust chemical engineering procedure from the 1800s, the era of the gaslight. If the idea worked, astronauts could land a relatively light ship with empty tanks. They wouldn't have to ship all the fuel with them for their return trip. The only problem was methane-oxygen fuel requires a hydrogen component. Hydrogen exists on Mars in the form of H2O, but water may be difficult or impossible to extract from the Martian environment.
Really, the hydrogen was only 5% of the total weight of the methane-oxygen propellant being manufactured. So if you just say, okay, we won't be pure, we won't get all of the propellant from Mars, we'll just get 95% of the propellant from Mars. The other 5%, the hydrogen, we'll just bring from Earth.
But their proposed spaceship was still too heavy. Then Zubrin had a brainwave.
Well, one of the key events of the Mars Direct development was one morning Bob burst in my office and said, "I've got it."
The idea that I finally hit on in 1989 was that we would split the mission up into two parts, and we'd send the return vehicle out first with its own return propellant plant. So the propellant would be made on Mars before the first astronauts ever left Earth.
With two separate direct-to-Mars launches, a human crew would have a fully fueled ship waiting for them on the surface of Mars before they had even left Earth. So Zubrin and Baker had come up with a plan that seemed to accomplish all of their goals. It was relatively inexpensive, development time was short, they could use existing technology, and it allowed for a long stay on the Martian surface. They dubbed their idea Mars Direct.
4, 3, 2, 1, engine start.
Once upon a time, in the not-too-distant future. Carrying the most skillfully assembled flight team in history, 4 astronauts begin their 2-year mission to the Red Planet. This will be the first time a human has gone beyond the Earth-Moon system, 400 million kilometers further than any person has ever been. To counter the health problems of zero gravity and enable the astronauts to fully acclimatize to the conditions on Mars, the ship will deploy a weighted tether attached to the last stage of the spent rocket booster. By thrusting the ship into a rotational spin, the counterweight of the rocket will create centrifugal force and thus artificial gravity. The crew will be able to live with their feet planted firmly on the floor during their 6-month transit. Already on the surface sits the Earth Return Vehicle, or ERV. For 6 months, its chemical plant has produced the methane-oxygen rocket fuel for the launch home.
Picking up the set. Big shadow. 4 forward, drift into the right level. 30 seconds forward drift. Contact light. Okay, engine stop.
We're seeing it on the LTP.
For more than 500 days, the astronauts will live on Mars and embark on one of the greatest journeys of discovery in the history of science. Will they find life? or the fossilized remains of past life. Such a discovery could tell us whether our solar system has seen more than one Genesis, and answer the ultimate question, are we alone? In any case, these explorers will be learning how feasible the colonization of Mars really is. Then, when the time comes and the window for Earth return opens, the crew will climb into their vehicle and head home. What began as a trickle will rise into a deluge of humankind, sweeping over a once barren land and transforming it into a viable new world. Well, that was the plan. When Baker and Zubrin presented Mars Direct to their bosses at Martin, they expected the worst. To their surprise, the management was excited about it. They liked the fact that everything needed was relatively simple.
As time went on, Martin Marietta embraced Mars Direct as their creation and put Bob and I on an airplane to several NASA centers to present Mars Direct and try to build some momentum for it.
Baker and Zubrin flew to one of the most conservative NASA groups, Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville, Alabama. This had been one of the original design hubs for the Apollo moon landings, but recently many of the engineers had become demoralized by the failure of NASA's Mars program. Together, Baker and Zubrin presented their alternative mission architecture. The response was thrilling. The old-school Apollo crowd embraced it. This was a plan that actually made sense and was within reach. Over the next few weeks, Zubrin and Baker were flown around the country, pitching to all branches of NASA, and everywhere they went, the response was electric. The plan was standing up to scrutiny, and groups all over NASA were converting to Mars Direct. Their tour culminated in a public presentation to the National Space Society. The crowd gave the two aerospace engineers a standing ovation. A week later, the American press picked up the story. But a counterattack was beginning to form within NASA. The space station teams and many in the advanced propulsion groups were against the idea. Since Mars Direct didn't need their programs, they felt under threat. As quickly as doors opened for Zubrin and Baker, they began to close. The race to launch a manned mission to Mars has pitted the might of NASA against two solitary scientists. As NASA grappled with a complex and highly expensive program, David Baker and Robert Zubrin blew the scientific community apart by coming up with a strikingly simple plan called Mars Direct. It was greeted with adulation. But no sooner had the applause died down than NASA fought back.
NASA didn't want to pursue a Mars mission at that time. They didn't want to be derailed by a bunch of Mars fanatics that thought that their idea of what NASA should do should overwhelm what NASA thought NASA should do.
Fearful that their own research would be rendered useless, NASA rejected Mars Direct. The two engineers were outsiders again, but Zubrin remained determined.
Bob had grabbed hold of it, and I could see that it was his, and no matter what I did, he was going to do what he was going to do, and he was going to be a proponent for it and push it, and I really saw my role sort of evaporate. It's a little bit like being a dim planet next to a bright star around him in terms of his enthusiasm, and you really can't compete with that. All you can do is decide how you're going to deal with it.
By February 1991, Baker had quit Martin Marietta Astronautics to start his own firm. Zubrin battled on. For the next year and a half, Zubrin tried to get NASA to pay attention, giving speeches, writing papers. But Mars Direct's time seemed to have passed. But then a new administration came into power at NASA. They challenged Zubrin to prove rocket fuel could be produced on Mars. And he did. Dan Golden, the new administrator at NASA, got Zubrin to give detailed briefings to the engineers at the Johnson Space Center. They liked it, but had some reservations.
There were a number of things that we were concerned about with Bob Zubrin's mission. First of all, we thought his estimates of mass were probably too optimistic. Didn't have sufficient margins for a variety of things, not the least of which would be things like provisions for the crew, the amount of water that would be required. We thought his ascent vehicle was very large, which meant his power requirements, his propellant requirements were much larger than needed to be.
Weaver took Zubrin into his office and the two men worked out a compromise plan. First, Weaver wanted 3 launches for every mission instead of 2. In the first year, 3 ships would launch: an MAV, a Mars ascent vehicle, an unoccupied HAB with extra supplies, and an ERV, an Earth return vehicle. The HAB and MAV would land on the surface and begin producing fuel for the return flight and air for the crew. These craft would spend 2 solitary years on Mars, allowing NASA to test all of the systems before sending a human crew. Then in the 3rd year, 3 more ships would launch, this time with the HAB occupied by astronauts. The other 2 ships were for a future mission, unless needed for a backup for the present crew. Once on Mars, the team could also utilize the first HAB. Then, after a 1.5-year stay, the crew would climb aboard their small capsule, blast off, and rendezvous with the return ship. This ship would carry them back home in a roomier environment than Zubrin's ERV. Zubrin called the plan Mars Semi-Direct. NASA called it the Design Reference Mission. The plan was subjected to the same cost analysis as NASA's original Mars project, with its $450 billion price tag. The Design Reference Mission came back at a fraction of the cost, $55 billion. Spread out over 10 years, it could be done within NASA's existing budget. The plan made the cover of Newsweek. Here was a mission that was affordable and could be carried out with today's technology. But NASA's astronauts have not left low Earth orbit since. In the wake of the Columbia tragedy, a debate has raged over the future of space exploration. Should NASA continue to focus on low Earth orbit, developing technologies for the future? Or should NASA have a goal like it did in the 1960s with Apollo?
The way we got to the moon was by a presidential imperative that demanded that NASA get to the moon within a decade. So NASA was forced to sit down, design a plan for how to do that, and then fly the mission. Since that time, without the presence of a driving imperative, we engage in basically a random set of constituency-driven programs which are justified ad hoc afterwards by the argument that they could prove useful at some time in the future when you actually have a plan to go somewhere. The American space program's been stagnant for 30 years. There's a once-in-a-generation shot right now to get it moving again by giving it a goal that'll take it somewhere. So the stakes today are high. And if you ask me if I am nervous right now, I am.
Dr. Zubrin.
Why is NASA stuck in low Earth orbit? The problem with NASA's lack of current achievement is not money. The problem is lack of focus, it's lack of a goal. It shouldn't be humans to Mars in 50 years. It should be humans to Mars in 10. We can do this. We do not need gigantic nuclear electric spaceships to send people to Mars. That is pork, it's nonsense. The primary question I get from the American people is, why aren't we doing this? There's a big sense of disappointment, almost verging on a sense of betrayal. The purpose of spaceships is to actually travel across space and go to new worlds, not to hang out in space and observe the health effects from doing so.
Dr. Zubrin, in your testimony, you were very passionate, but you also were mad. You're mad we haven't done this, or that this vision has been stolen from a generation?
I guess you could say that. It's like Columbus coming back from the New World and Ferdinand and Isabella saying, so what, forget it, burn the ships. Okay, you know, that's what has happened in this country. We've won our point that there needs to be a destination. What we need, the point we need to win on now is that the destination needs to be Mars, and it needs to be soon.
Like the Apollo missions to the Moon, sending human beings to Mars is perilous. There are many dangers in outer space, some known, some not. A serious equipment breakdown could doom the crew to their deaths. Some argue that the risk of failure is simply too high.
You know, back in the days when medieval man was looking out from Europe and thinking about exploring the world was unknown, and map makers populated their maps with dragons. We've got the same thing today. There are people who are afraid to go out into space, and they've populated their maps of the solar system with dragons. But these are dragons that we can take on.
Welcome to the Dragon's Lair, where two kinds of radiation reign supreme: solar flares and cosmic rays. Solar flares are floods of protons that burst from the sun at irregular intervals and would be dangerous to an unshielded human crew.
We are not ready to send humans to Mars right now. We've got to know a lot more about radiation and radiation mitigation. One of the Apollo flights barely missed, like by a week, a major solar event. If it had gone off when the Apollo astronauts were on the way back and forth to the moon, they would have gotten their entire lifetime radiation dose in that one mission. And that's just one solar flare. So that's why we worry about this.
In the Mars Direct plan, Zubrin envisions a central insulated core where a crew could retreat. The core would be surrounded on the lower level by all of the provisions of the mission. This should stop any harmful dose of radiation from reaching the astronauts. Fortunately, solar flares are predictable, and the crew could be forewarned by astronomers on Earth.
Basically, you use your pantry as your storm shelter. So a solar flare happens, the alarm bell rings, the crew goes into the storm shelter, they stay in there cramped up pretty tight for a few hours until the all clear rings and they come out. This is going to happen once, it might happen twice in the course of the mission.
The second type of radiation is cosmic rays. This constant rain of charged particles comes from interstellar space and cannot be avoided without many meters of shielding. Over short periods of exposure, cosmic rays are not a great concern, but over longer periods, they could prove lethal.
It's a long trip. It's a 6-month trip there, a 6-month trip back. It's probably a year on the surface. That's a lot of radiation.
The best estimates are that the magnitude of that dose that you would get in the 2.5-year round-trip mission is not that great. Perhaps 60 rem of radiation scattered over 2.5 years. Now, 60 rem of radiation delivered over a long period of time like that would not create any noticeable effects at all. It would, though it is believed, increase your statistical risk of getting cancer at some point later in your life by about 1%. Right now, if you're an average American and you do not smoke, you have a 20% chance you're going to die of cancer. This would make it 21. If you're an average American smoker, it's 40. So in fact, if you recruited the Mars crew out of smokers and sent them to Mars without their tobacco, you would be reducing their chance of getting cancer.
With the immense distance from Earth never before experienced by a human being, and with the constant dangers of outer space surrounding their small life-sustaining craft, the psychological impact on a crew could be severe.
Fear is real. I mean, it would be, to me, abnormal for a person to not feel the fear of getting on a rocket and launching into space and going to Mars. So I think fear is a very normal thing that all astronauts, in fact, are supposed to have. And I would be afraid to fly with someone who does not have fear.
Some psychologists worry that cabin fever could set in and the crew might literally go crazy. A Mars crew would need to be carefully chosen and thoroughly tested to ensure their ability to handle the extreme isolation.
Wow, what a place. What a view, isn't it, John?
John Young, who went to the moon, used to say that he could cover the Earth by just lifting his thumb up to it. And he says that when you go to Mars, you are going to redefine the concept of loneliness. And so it is very important that the crew be well balanced and well chosen so that they can support each other.
Whoever gets picked to go would have to learn to live together for over 2 years.
If you put out a call for volunteers for the first crew to Mars, they'd be lined up coast to coast. Most people recognize what's left after you go is the good you left behind. And to take part in a venture of this character, of such a historic character, of extending the reach of the human species, this is something of immortal significance.
Will there be human settlements on the planet? Will Mars become a new branch of human civilization? As each subsequent Mars mission explores a wider and wider area, an ideal site for a base will be found. Probably one with a thermal vent that can supply water and power. At that point, several HABs will be landed in this one spot, with crews that plan to stay for 4, 8, or even 12 years. With this, a permanent human presence on Mars will be established. This scientific community would have to learn to become self-sufficient, to be able to survive on Mars without supplies constantly being sent from Earth. Apart from Earth, Mars is the only planet in the solar system that has all of the fundamentals needed to make human life a possibility. Its 24-hour and 37-minute day is critical for growing plants. It has all of the elements necessary for creating building materials like plastics, metals, and glass. It has oceans of water frozen into the soil. Eventually, the scientists would learn to live off the land. They'd grow crops in the iron-rich but potassium-poor soil and would produce oxygen and energy from the water and atmosphere. In time, not only scientists, but settlers would arrive. This brave new world would attract the political, religious, and financially driven. For them, Mars would be a chance to build new lives for themselves.
Mars is not going to be a utopia. Mars is going to be a lab. It's an open frontier. It's a place where things are going to be tried out. I think we'll see a lot of noble experiments on Mars.
The ultimate dream of the Martians would be to terraform their planet, to make Mars as hospitable as Earth. This may not be as big a fantasy as it seems.
Once there are large human settlements on Mars that would have significant industrial capability, we could actually start addressing ourselves to the question of transforming the Martian environment itself, terraforming Mars, as it's called, because Mars was once a warm and wet planet, and it could be made so again through human engineering efforts.
With daytime temperatures in the Martian tropical zone averaging around 0 degrees centigrade, and with an atmosphere only 1% as thick as Earth's, exposure to these elements without a spacesuit would be instantly fatal. The first step to terraforming Mars and bringing it back to life would be for the Martian colonists to warm up their planet.
Well, we know how to warm up planets. We're doing it on Earth by putting gases in the atmosphere. On Earth, it's not a good idea to warm up the planet. The temperature was just fine, thank you. We don't need it any warmer here. But in principle, if you could trap the sunlight reaching Mars today every single photon that's hitting Mars, Mars would warm up in about 10 years. Well, obviously you can't trap every single photon that's hitting Mars, but you can trap about 10% of them with the greenhouse effect. So that would imply that Mars could warm up in about 100 years. Well, 100 years is a long time, but it's not astronomically long.
One idea is to build small automated factories that produce super greenhouse gases with no ozone-depleting side effects. Although these gases would be unwelcome on Earth, for the Martians, they would be an efficient way to trap heat. This steamroller effect would cause massive amounts of carbon dioxide, currently absorbed into the Martian soil, to start to outgas. Carbon dioxide is also a natural greenhouse gas. The process would become automatic, and as the atmosphere thickened, Mars would eventually reach a state of equilibrium and stay warm naturally. The rise in air pressure would mean that the human colonists could discard their pressure suits and walk around the surface of Mars carrying their own oxygen supply. And as the temperatures rose on Mars, water frozen into the soil would begin to melt out. And for the second time in its history, Mars would have liquid water on its surface. Dry Martian rivers would flow, seas rise, and there would be rain clouds in the skies. The return of Mars to its warm, wet stage would make any indigenous Martian organisms lying dormant begin to grow, and Mars would be full of Martians. When asked the question again, is there life on Mars? This time, we'd finally have the answer.
Half of me is human race, the other half is wild. There's nothing here. It's Mars.
I have turned the whole world into a laboratory.
Films that make you think. The Boys from Brazil, Saturday at 9 on Discovery.
Looking to save money on your car insurance? Visit the experts. GoCompare.com. First, they'll compare the best prices from loads of insurance companies. Then, and here's the clever part, tell them
What will be the catalyst that propels man to colonize Mars? Will it be a question of imperatives as our own world slowly dies? Or simply a scientific challenge to be overcome by the driven? Just a small pocket of scientists could trigger the process that would one day lead to life on Mars. By creating a warm, wet climate, Mars would become a fertile environment. Any indigenous organisms lying dormant would begin to grow, and Mars would be full of Martians. If no native life emerges, or that life is all dead, then humans could begin addressing the idea of bringing life from Earth. At first, it would be simple organisms, perhaps genetically engineered, that would thrive in the Martian environment. Then more complex plants could be introduced. The plants would be right at home in a carbon dioxide atmosphere. And with no competition, and a whole planet to cover, they could transform Mars into a green world. Warming Mars so that it sustains life would be a human endeavor. But the slow job of making the atmosphere breathable could only be done by the plants. If the colonists couldn't find a way to accelerate the process, it would take tens of thousands of years.
This is a philosophical debate. Many people think the universe has a big sign on it that says, "Do not touch." leave it alone. It was made this way. It is not in our purview as human beings to change anything. I can respect that view, although I disagree with it. I think the universe has a big sign on it that says, go forth and spread life. Because when I look around the universe, I think life is the most amazing thing we see. It is just incredible. And we human beings are uniquely positioned to help spread life from this little tiny planet, which it seems to have been started on, beyond. And that's our gift. Earth's gift to the universe, I think, is the gift of life.
Robert Zubrin, co-creator of the radical Mars Direct project, believes it's not a matter of if we colonize Mars, just when.
This scheme for terraforming Mars is based on 20th century notions of engineering. I don't think it is how Mars will actually be terraformed. What you have here is a 20th century mind trying to address a 22nd century problem. And so I think Mars will be terraformed by the 23rd century, not by the 33rd, by the 23rd. Things that would seem utterly fantastical to us is how it will actually be done, but it'll be done. You have to believe in hope. You have to believe in the future. There are more and more people coming around to the point of view that a positive future for humanity requires human expansion into space. We will eventually break through the forces of inertia that have been holding this thing back.
Space Week continues tomorrow at 9 as we learn how scientists working without computer software managed to put a man on the moon. Next, the witching hour begins in A Haunting.